whenever I read about the great Barks and the stuff that he wrote, it seems to me they're writing about someone else. I can't attach myself to that at all. We're a different person. I used to go to the drugstores or wherever there was a newsstand, and if I happened to be around when I had a little time on my hands, I would stand around that newsstand pretending I was looking at popular mechanics or something and watch the kids who would come in. Of course, at that time, kids would always come in where there was a big stack of comic books and just sit down on one stack and pick up comic books out of the next stack and read them or look to you. And I always hoped that I would see some kid buy a Walt Disney Comics or an Uncle Scrooge. I never did. They always picked up Superman or a Harvey comic or an Oswald Rabbit and something, but never did one of them even look at an Uncle Scrooge or a Donald Duck. I used to wonder, what on earth did they do with these big stacks of Walt Disney comics? It'd be 2 feet high sometime. What on earth did they do with them? They tear up all those covers and send all of those back? Is the company crazy? But evidently some kids were buying them always sly when I could see them.
Would you tell us what you feel your largest and most important early influences, especially in terms of artists, were?
Well, it was reading the newspaper comic strips, and I can go clear back as far as Winslow McKay as one of the influences. But I would say that Barney Google and Happy Hooligan, and later on the Disney comics of Mickey Mouse were the influences. I liked the Mickey Mouse stories because they had humor in them. And when you look at my later stories in the comic books, you'll see that I was kind of following the format that Lloyd Godfredson established, of having Mickey and the other guys involved in funny situations at the same time they were having serious problems. And they solved their serious problems by funny means, some outrageous sort of thing that would happen. And I guess that is where I automatically formed the basis for my own story writing.
And I know you had a lot of different careers. And
I wouldn't call them careers. I was a real misfit. I couldn't do anything good.
tell some of the things you did?
Oh, I started out, I wanted to be a cartoonist, of course, all of my life, from the time I was a kid, but that required a little bit of training, and being a kid on a ranch up in eastern Oregon, I didn't have much opportunity to meet other cartoonists or learn anything, but I did do a lot of drawing, looking at the San Francisco Examiner and the other newspapers we would get that carried comic strips. But I just automatically had to drift into farming and driving a bunch of mules around a field behind a plow or a grain drill or something. It just wasn't anything that I liked. And from that, I finally saved up enough money to tell my dad that I wanted to go to San Francisco and see if I couldn't get into cartooning down there. So I went to San Francisco and I worked for a little over a year in a printing shop. Yeah, I had nothing to do with cartooning, but it was at least a living while I would go once in a while to one of the newspaper offices and show them some sample cartoons and get rejected and practically thrown out of the place. They had good cartoonists working for them in those days. They didn't have to take on some kid that didn't have any training. But I could read all those wonderful newspapers full of cartoons, and I learned a great deal while I was there in San Francisco. Then after I left there, I had to go back to the ranch again. And from there, I drifted into logging, working in the logging woods. And from there, I drifted into working for the railroad in the car shops on a riveting gang. I was there for about 6.5 years on that lousy riveting gang. And in the meantime, I kept always trying to develop cartooning. And I realized that in order to sell cartoons, you have to have an idea behind them, a little bit of writing to go along with them. So I began developing the art of writing a little humor to go with my cartoons. So I got to selling gags to the Calgary Eye Opener, and that led to me getting a job back there as staff artist. And from that, it was just a step into the editor job as they gradually got less and less money through the Depression, and they couldn't hire any editors. It just developed on me to do it all. So from there, I got into Disney's by sending some samples to Disney's. And so my whole life was just devoted to trying one step after another toward becoming a cartoonist.
What was it like to work at the Disney studio at this time?
What was it like to work?
Yeah.
Well, it was a trepidatious period, I'll say. Everybody were trembly and thinking they were going to get the axe at the end of the week. We started out in the in-between department there on just tryouts. I got $20 a week. And when I got put on regular at the end of the month's tryout, I got $22.50. Believe me, that was, well, it was pretty good wages for those days. It could pay the rent, buy you something to eat, car fare, nickel car fare, go all over Los Angeles for a nickel. Well, naturally, I didn't like the in-betweens where I was working and was very eager to try out for these gags that they wanted for the story department. And like I say, I got into the story department on the strength of one of those gags. We were trying to think of things that Donald could invent or that he could get involved in. And so I happened to come up with the thought of a barber chair that would automatically clip somebody's hair. And Donald, being a precocious character, sort of messed up the machinery in it by trying to get his coin back. And I had no idea how the gag would be used. I just created a situation in which Donald got in this barber chair and he messed up the machinery. It flipped him upside down and gave him a haircut on the wrong end. And I also included the little gag about the shoe shine apparatus found at where the feet would be, and that is where his beak was in this situation. So he got a shoe shine on his beak. And when the gag was turned in, I had drawn it all in sort of comic book for a strip way of drawing things, presenting the idea. Walt saw it and liked it and paid me $50 for the gag, suggested that I should be put in the story department. So that was the opening that got me in there. An upside-down barber chair.
And then you, that cartoon, Modern Inventions, really developed out of that gag, right? I mean,
well, that was the gag that could cause Walt and the others to think that they could get enough material to make a picture on that subject. It was the climactic gag of the thing.
So it sort of worked backwards. You started with the end and then built the whole cartoon toward it.
Well, on those stories that we did for animation, we always tried to get a good, interesting, climactic situation and then find a reason for that situation. And that would give us a beginning to the story, and then we build up the gags all the way up to that big situation. It was a good way of making stories. It worked good in writing for the comic books, too. To find a good, big, climactic gag, a very interesting situation, and then build everything up to that. You automatically write the story that way. Automatically. I was ignorant about the whole thing. I didn't know what it would happen to me once I got in that studio. In fact, I didn't know that they had separate story departments and animation departments. I thought it was all just an informal thing in which a bunch of guys who could draw would gather around and figure out what they were going to draw and automatically come up with a little story of some kind and then just go ahead and work out the animation of it. So after I got in the studio and saw that it was all broken down into categories, you were either an in-betweener or an assistant animator or an animator or a story man or a cameraman. You weren't anything else. You were just one of those things, and once you got in that bracket, you were there.
How large a role do you feel you played in shaping Donald's character in the animated cartoons? In other words, what kind of control did you actually have there?
Oh, I had no control other than just making suggestions, or where I would sit at my drawing board and sketch up the business of some sequence of action, while I was naturally adding a little to Donald's character, because he was just an invention at that time, and everybody that worked on him added something to him by some little new facet of his character, the way he was drawn, or the way he would smile or yell or gesture. All those things were the result of a whole lot of guys working just same as I was.
Well, in later cartoons, when they would give credits for people, the different roles that people played, they would say something like story by and give a name. Now, is that the kind of role you ever played in the cartoons, that is basically doing pretty much the whole story, whatever that means, from beginning to end of the cartoons?
No, I never was on a story in which I was the lone character. I don't believe there was any such a thing ever happened around there. There was always more than one guy on each story. A guy could think up a story idea. Homer Brightman was a great one for thinking up story ideas. Ralph Wright was another. They just think them up out of nowhere. And then once a story idea was presented to the other story men, a whole bunch of guys would work on it. Of course, there was usually 2 guys to a unit. They did the most of the work, but they would call in these other fellows for conferences to help them out. So I don't believe there was ever anything went out of there that was a one-man operation.
What did you like the most and the least about animation? And that would lead to the question of why you finally decided to get out of it.
Well, if I could have started out right away as an animator, I believe I might have liked animation. But the fact that I would have to do a year or 2 years of in-betweening before I could ever be trusted to do any animation sort of turned me off. I just felt it wasn't worth all that struggle. I always felt that I could do animation, just thinking it out in my head. Timing the movements of the characters, the way they would set their expressions, and things they would do. I thought I could do it. I believe I could, even at this late date. Knowing what I do about the problems of animation, I believe that I could have just started out with a bunch of paper and pencils and turned out something that would have looked pretty good.
How did you?
That's a lot of ego.
Do you think that animation would be, in that? Therefore, you think that animation is essentially no more difficult to do than a comic book, or maybe even easier?
Oh, animation be much more difficult. It's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done to move one character from point A to point B. In the comic book, you simply draw him here, he's at point A, and then one more drawing and he's over at point B. It's so much simpler. You don't have all of that tedious stuff in between, and you move your things around so much faster. Your scenery, everything is all tied up in one drawing, for instance. What the characters think, how they act, and how they're doing anything, what their problems are. It's all told one little picture. In animation, you do 1,000 pictures to tell that one thing. Yeah, even though I feel confident that I could do a small bit of animation and make it look all right, I know it would be very difficult to do.
Do you have any remembrances of Walt Disney?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Walt would come in on story conferences. He was quite a comedian, that guy. That is a good gag man. I mean, he wasn't a comedian in the sense of O.W.C. Fields or such a thing, but he could just talk gags. He wasn't one that laughed much at his own gags. He just think up a gag and tell it. Say that you should put such and such a gag up there on your storyboard. And all of his stuff was good.
Kimball.
Big help on story conference.
Ward Kimball said that quite often people in the story department would reach an impasse and Disney would walk in and just say, oh, you should do this and solve the problem. Is that your sense of his role there?
Right. They were always hoping that he might drop in accidentally and save them having to have a formal news conference.
Did he have much control over the cartoons? In other words, did he determine quite a bit what went into them, or in terms of continuity, so that they all had a certain look and a certain style and a certain emphasis?
No, we were supposed to work all that out without bothering him. He would just come in to say whether the story was good enough. We had it put together. Now we were supposed to work all those minor problems out.
Was there any attempt to have a Disney look or a Disney style?
Well, I think that Disney style just came out without anybody consciously thinking about it. We all knew that this stuff had to come up to a certain standard, and the gags had to be of a certain type, and so everybody worked toward that one goal, and they just automatically came out looking like Disney stuff.
How did you get your start in comics?
In comic books?
Yeah.
Well, I used to buy the comic books on the newsstands, and I thought, oh, that's a field I would like to get into, because I could write my own stories and draw them the way I saw fit, providing an editor was the kind of a guy who would let me do it. And so I was just sort of pointing myself in that direction of doing comic books through the latter years that I was working at Disney's. I think in the early 30s, 33, 34, and so on, the Superman comics and all those were beginning to appear on the newsstands. Well, I would buy those and read them and think that I could probably invent characters and do that kind of stuff.
You said earlier that characters like Barney Google influenced your art. Were there any specifically comic book characters that were, or comic book titles that influenced you?
Oh, I can't think of any comic books that influenced me. They stimulated my interest, but they also made me think, well, I can do something different. I saw the Superman stuff and all, and there were some of the comic books in those days that weren't Superman. They were about aviation heroes and so on that were more everyday, and I really related to them more than I did the superhero.
What did you want to do that was different?
Well, I wanted to do like I did with the ducks, just create a real world and have them meet their problems with the everyday things, the everyday weapons that we have to do with in our own lives.
4-Color 9, Pirate Gold. How did that come about, that you were chosen or whatever to do that?
Well, that 4-Color 9 came from a story that Harry Reeves and Homer Brightman, I believe, was the crew that had worked up this story in which what was it, Mickey or Donald? I can't remember whether they were working with Mickey on that to go to the dig for treasure, hunt that treasure. And there was a parrot in that and so on. Yeah, I think maybe it was a Mickey story they were doing. But anyway, the whole basis was there for a story for animation, and it followed this script as you see it in the comic book very closely, and it had been shelved, and so it happened that Oscar Lee Beck, I believe is the fellow who was from Western Publishing, was out there at the studio looking for material that could be adapted for comic books. And he saw that script in storyboard form and thought that would make a good duck story. So he just told him to go ahead and find somebody around the studio who could adapt that to comic book continuity and let him adapt it and then see if there was anybody in the studio who would draw it. So Bob Karp, who worked in the comic book department, the comic strip department, he took the storyboards and didn't take them home. He took photostats of them, and from the photostats, he developed that strip. And then Jack Hanna and I took the script that he wrote. It's all typewritten. We had to visualize everything from the typewritten script. And we went to work on it and drew it. So that was the start of the comic books.
What kind of different problems do you see in between doing a storyboard like for Donald Animation and doing a comic book story?
There wasn't a great deal of difference other than that when you're doing a storyboard, you have to do many more small changes of expressions and so on. That is, where there is one panel in a comic book that will tell something, there would have to be 5 drawings maybe on a storyboard to tell the same little thing. Because you have to give the animators sort of a scene break. It's almost like every scene or every camera cut had to be shown on the storyboard.
Well, one of the things you're most famous for is the creation of your characters. That whole family of ducks that grew out of Donald and his nephews in the comic books.
I guess that it was that I carried in my head the idea that there was a whole town and a whole family of characters all around these ducks at all times that I wasn't showing. There were cousins and nephews and nieces and villains and bankers and all kinds of people that they had dealings with in their everyday life that I didn't have to show in any of the stories that I had done. And so whenever I needed one, I would just create one that apparently had been around all the time, but just hadn't been used. And the way I presented them evidently is like it was in my head, that they'd been there all the time, but I just hadn't used them.
Can you remember anything about specific inspirations for characters like Scrooge, Gladstone, Gyro? Beagle Boys and so on?
Well, I think the reason for bringing in Gladstone was that I thought of this situation of Donald having to take a midwinter swim in a lake of ice cold water. And it was something, I guess, from reading of the Polar Bear Club up in San Francisco to go out the Golden Gate and swim around on New Year's Day and that sort of thing. And I just thought of Donald, how in the summertime he would get very rash and boast that he would go into the water in the wintertime. And so that's how Gladstone got into it. He had to be somebody that Donald was trying to outdo.
How did you come up with the name? You know where you got the name from?
Well, Gander and Gladstone, it's a phonetic thing. What about Scrooge? Donald Duck is phonetic, Wouldn't say Frank Duck.
Before we get this Scrooge, can I ask where the idea to have to give Gladstone his incredible luck came from?
Well, that came the second time I was using him. I established him as a sort of an obnoxious character in that first story, and so the second time I used him, I thought of what particular thing can make that guy lastingly obnoxious, and so I thought of this lucky angle. He was the kind of a guy who got all the breaks, and poor Donald never got anywhere.
What about Scrooge, the most famous?
Well, there again, it was the office, I think, wanted me to do a Christmas story. And so I was casting around for Christmas stories. I began to think of the great Dickens Christmas story about Scrooge. And somehow it is the classic of all Christmas stories. Well, I just was just deep enough to sort of steal some of the idea and have a rich uncle for Donald. And all these situations of the bear and Donald having to go to this cabin in the wintertime to prove his bravery and so on, it just came out of the situation of bringing in a rich uncle. I guess it was the invention of the rich uncle that led to the reason for Donald having to go to the cabin, because the rich uncle wanted Donald to prove how brave he was, so that the rich uncle would have someone to whom he could leave all of his wealth. And Donald, being a very unworthy relative, had to prove he was worth it. The second time I used Scrooge was, I guess, in the story of the old castle. Well, he had turned out to be kind of an interesting character in that first story, and so I began thinking of a way to use him again. And the old castle sort of established more of Scrooge's character. I guess the fact that he was rich was the thing that triggered all further developments, is just how rich and the showing of his wealth. I found that was quite a fascinating subject, just piles of money. It seemed to appeal to a lot of people. And I just gradually made him richer and richer, and then I had to develop a place where he could store the money. And all the time there were the Beagle Boys trying to steal it from him. Those things just grew like building brick walls. You just lay one brick on top of another and finally you got a whole thing built.
That's often said about Scrooge being the arch capitalist and so on. You don't quite agree with that, do you? Because he doesn't spend his money. Right?
Oh, he is a complete enemy of the capital system. He would destroy it in 1 year's time. There would no longer be any capitalism or free enterprise, because he would freeze onto all the stuff that keeps capitalism going. It is the spending of money. The faster money is spent, the more prosperity everybody has. And Scrooge never spends anything, so everybody would progressively go poorer as he accumulated more of their money, and finally nobody would have any money but him, and he wouldn't spend any of it, so that would be the end of capitalism.
How did you ever get the idea of having him swim around and bury himself, tunnel through it like a gopher and let it...
Well, I don't know how I got on that idea, but it just seemed like a ridiculous thing to play with his money, physically play with it, and those were things that he could do with it that make a good picture in a comic book. We know when you spark up a few dollars and you touch them, they're hard. They don't yield or bounce around like water. You can't dive into a pile of money like you would into a snowdrift. So he had to have a trick by which he did it. And I don't explain that trick because I don't understand it myself. I mean, he can go out in the desert and he can smell the presence cold. Other prospectors would have to dig mountains of dirt before they could find any nuggets, but he can smell them. I think he represents something that nearly everybody wishes they could be. For some time in their life, just a little bit too rich.
Is this some fantasy that you had that you always wanted to be able to do this?
No, it has no relation to my own life or my own desires in life. I never had any desire to be rich, and I always felt myself to be somewhat of an unlucky person, but that's the only attachment I can say between me and Donald, is that Donald was a victim of so many circumstances, but Donald was also making those circumstances against himself by his own stupidity. Now I just created those characters out of whole cloth. They had nothing to do with my own psychology.
Did you identify with one character more than another?
Oh, I would identify more with Donald than I would with any of the others. Because when you look at Donald, he was everything. He was everybody. There isn't a person in the United States that couldn't identify with Donald, because he's always been in situations in which nearly every person finds themselves in at different times. Makes the same mistakes that we all make.
Do you find him the most interesting character?
Well, yes, I guess so, because he's more interesting in more different situations. Now, Uncle Scrooge is very interesting in situations involving money and the finding of wealth and so on. He's more interesting than Donald could be, but Donald can spread over a whole bunch of situations. He can be a fireman or a sailor or anything, and he has to be interesting in all of it.
How did you feel about the introduction of the nephews? Did it seem like a good idea?
Well, I was against it at first. Mickey had 3 little nephews. I see he only has 2 nowadays. They destroyed one of them. I guess they were saved paper. But anyway, he had 3 little nephews, and when the suggestion came along that Donald should have 3 nephews, I thought, oh my God, here we're going to have all these little kids to draw and think up things for them, but I was working for wages, so I had to go along with the ideas. And I happened to be in the story department and working on the duck stuff, so along came this idea to create some nephews for Donald. And so we developed the little guys, and it turned out they were a good idea. They didn't create a lot of trouble for us in making up those gags. It gave Donald a good foil to work with.
Whose idea was it to create the nephews?
What's that?
Whose idea was it to create
Oh,
that?
that was came out of the animation department. I think somebody over there, Joe Sabo or someone in the animation department, an in-betweener, just sent over a little note to the story department saying, why not have Donald have some nephews? At that term, they used to send out little resumes from this story department to the animation department, asking for any kind of suggestions, any kind of ideas, or new stories, or in case there was a story in the works over at the story department, we would send an outline of that story to the animation department and ask anybody who could think up any kind of a situation that would be interesting or helpful to that story to turn it in. That's how I turned in that barber chair gag. It was on that same sort of thing. So that's how the nephews got invented. And then a guy named Dana Cody, who was working in the story department, he thought of the names for Huey, Louie, and Dewey. Names that would rhyme and had a phonetic quality.
There's a reversal in roles between Donald and the nephews. In other words, Donald is supposed to be kind of a parental figure, but actually the nephews are the real parental figures, and Donald has to be taken care of a lot of the time. How did you come up with that, and why did you do it?
Well, I think from the very start, Donald was the hapless comedian. Anything that bad things that happened would have to happen to him. I couldn't have the little kids get squashed or kicked around. And the kids can get themselves in some pretty bad messes through something they do wrong, and then Donald has a chance to rescue them. So I use that angle once in a while. But mostly it was Donald who was the guy who was going to get clobbered and the kids who were going to rescue him. It worked out better, and it seemed as if it was appealed to more people that way. Because the readers were kids themselves, they liked to feel a little bit superior to that uncle that was strutting around. And that brings up another point. I think that one of the things that puts over stories in comic strips or anything is, can you make the reader feel superior to those characters? Like Donald. You feel superior to him. The reader automatically does, because Donald is so bungly. And when he goes strutting around, you just know way ahead of him that he's going to just get clobbered good. And when the kids get on some binge in which they get into a hell of a problem, you feel superior to them because you know that they're going to have to think that solution out by very laborious methods. And the only one of my characters that you couldn't feel superior to was Gladstone. He just was so darn lucky that the reader just hated him because he had to look up to Gladstone because of that one talent he had. Now, in newspaper strips, you follow that gasoline alley. Have you noticed how many of those characters are submorons? The old guy with the donkey cart, and a guy with a funny cap, and the girl chambermaid, all of them, they're just submorons. The reader automatically feels superior to those characters. It gives the reader a good feeling. I think that that's one of the tricks of writing. I never thought about it until I was analyzing that gasoline alley one time, trying to think, well, why do I pick that thing up day after day and read it? I don't like those characters. I just despise them. Yet I keep on reading about it.
What about Gyro? How did he come about?
Well, I think that every cartoonist that ever run anything in comic strips and newspapers always had this crazy inventor at some time in their strips. So I was in need of a crazy inventor. Oh, I just deliberately invented gyro as a crazy inventor, but I had only figured on using him once in a great while. So I just made him a big awkward-looking chicken. If I had known her, I was going to have to do a book of gyro stories and so on, I would have made him about the same size as Donald and Uncle Scrooge so that he could have been handled much easier. And that he was this big, tall, gawky chicken and very difficult to work him in the same panels with the ducks all the time.
Don't you like to make pictures of inventions yourself, like Rube Goldberg machines? Did any of that?
Oh, I kind of liked it, didn't mind it at all. I'm kind of an inventor at heart. I can think of all kinds of crazy inventions. I would go broke if I ever tried to patent all the crazy things I think of.
Want to give us any examples?
Oh, no. Okay. Because I still think I've got some good ones.
All right. You created Duckburg. And one of the things about Duckburg was the fact that it had a history.
Well, it came out of the fact that it gave me a little material to write about. And the founder would naturally have to be a member of the feathered family. It was a coot. And then it gets back to the phonetics again. Cornelius Coot rhymes nicely. You wouldn't say George Coot. It wouldn't sound very good. The whole mayor, naturally, he was just always pushing anything that he could about Cornelius Coot and the building up of the glamour of Duckburg, because it sort of reflected back onto him. He got a little good out of it, a little exposure by always being out promoting statues for the founder of Duckburg and so on. And the contests that Uncle Scrooge and the Maharaja got into, of course, became more and more ridiculous as time went on. And I don't blame this woman for writing a letter afterward saying that she thought that it was a gross misuse of money to build these enormous statues all crusted with diamonds when there was so many things that could have been done with that money, like building hospitals and schools and better jails, all that sort of thing. I wrote back to the office, I think I did, telling them that the woman missed the point entirely, that all that money that had been spent on those statues had just been spent for labor and materials. All that money had gone into circulation, much better than if it had continued lying in the Maharaja's money bin or in Uncle Scrooge's money bin. All that money had created a tremendous amount of work. Work for jewelers and work for goldsmiths and the concrete men and the hydraulics experts. Everybody had a job out of that. So that money hadn't been wasted any more than it had been used in the building of hospitals.
Can you tell us how you came up with the Uncle Scrooge 1 story?
Well, they wrote a letter from the office and asked if I would do a Scrooge comic book, 32-page Scrooge. And I just thought, well, what little I had used Scrooge up to that time, he didn't have any foundation. That is, nobody knew where he came from. Although he had been Donald's uncle all these years, but what was his background? So I thought, well, I'll just work in a little bit about his background, where he came from and how he accumulated his wealth and how he's out to protect it. I had already invented the Beagle Boys at that time. And so I just turned loose on everything I could think of that would help to develop Scrooge's character.
Some of the characters or situations or whatever just came to you as a kind of splash or inspiration, like the measles, right? Do you remember how those came about?
That was a story that did, like you say, come as a sort of a flash. I've been struggling for days trying to think of something that I could use for a long story plot. And there was a whole bunch of company in the house at the time, and I never had time to really sit down and think of anything. And finally, I just got to the point where I just ignored the company, and I just sat by myself out on the lawn in the swing and did some serious thinking. And all of a sudden, while I was thinking, I got to thinking of the Everglades. And what could Donald do in the Everglades? And what sort of creatures besides alligators would he find out in the Everglades? And just like that, thought of all these queer little people, like little mummies that lived out in there. And as soon as I thought of them, why, ideas of how to use them just kept popping into my head. So I just sat there and let the thought just pour all over me, and I remembered as many as I could. When I had gotten enough that I knew I had a story, why, I joined the party and hoisted a few drinks. Next day I was hard at it, writing the measles story.
Did you often start off with the idea of a locale as a story and build it around that?
Yeah, the locale started to know more stories than anything else. Like as I say about the measles, I've thought of the Everglades. And I told Don before that often when I would be struggling for a story, I would think, what locale do I want to draw? Do I want to draw a forest? Or do I want to draw the sea with sailboats? Or would it be down in the mines, caves, or something? Oh, as soon as I think of a locale I would enjoy drawing, it seemed that I could much easier think of a reason for putting those characters in that locale. What would they be doing there? And then once I got an idea of why they were there, pretty quick I would have a big situation gag going in my head. And when I got that going, why, like in King Solomon's mines, get them down in the mines and then figure out what menaces that they got around them in the King Solomon's mines. They've got a gang of Arabs that are trying to get in there too. And how did they get there? And that brings in the play of the nephews and how they helped. All those things you just build backward from the big climactic situation, and pretty soon we've got the steps of a story.
What about the creation of locales that didn't exist, like the land of the Terrys and Fermies or Plain Awful? Those kinds of, how did those stories evolve?
Well, when you've got a mysterious place, do you develop something that just out of whole cloth, like that? It's a mysterious place down under the earth. We don't know what's down under the crust. Scientists tell us it's a big molten core and all that, but Uncle Scrooge thought that there was a hole down under there, and he was going to be darn sure that he knew where that hole was. So once I got down to this mysterious hole, why, I peopled it with imaginary little characters. And in other places.
A square egg story.
The square egg story, well, that business of the fog, there was this guy had gotten lost in this impenetrable fog. Nobody ever knew what was over beyond that. I just used my imagination and got this place that I could go wild on anything like that. There's nobody to prove that I could be crazy about it. It was something that could exist and nobody would ever have known it. So on the imaginary things, I went much wilder than I do on stories in which they are around familiar locales such as Egypt or Africa.
Why do you think it is that square egg story is the one that is usually mentioned as the one people remember the most?
Well, when you analyze the structure of the story, you see that it was built on little short sequence gags. Almost every page had a gag, or maybe two gags, which the characters moved through a little bit of action to a short climax, then switched to another little action, another climax. It just stepped up and up. All of these little situations had to deal with moving him along the main story plot.
You mentioned to me once that you started out with that story, but you didn't know how to end it, and you had a heck of a time trying to figure out how to end it.
Well, whenever I come to a story, I had a heck of a time ending. I can remember quite a number of them. I would have to go back into it and change something back inside this story to give me a step toward an ending. I would have to put some new business in. If the story just didn't end properly, why, it had something wrong with the steps that build up toward that end.
Where did you get the idea of a square egg from?
Having square eggs have been a joke for more years than I've been on Earth. I remember hearing people talk about getting chickens that would lay square eggs and so on from the time I was a little child.
What about Bambi the Zombie?
Well, that was a story that came from reading about voodoo, I guess, and zombies and so on. And when the guys are writing stories year after year like I was, you just got to be searching all the time for any subject that will make a story. So whenever I thought of something like a zombie or voodoos and so on, I would try to make a story out of it because it was interesting to a lot of people. And so I came up with Bambi the Zombie.
You made that character really sympathetic, though he never said a word and never really changed his expression.
Well, I was not writing for the horror comics, so I wasn't going to make him a ferocious, murderous sort of person. So I made him just a harmless old zombie who wandered around. He had just this one job that he had to do. He'd been at it for 50 years. All of those things developed as I was writing along on the story. Of course, it took several days to develop all those gag situations and the ridiculous thing that this old guy had started out 50 years before, that this little voodoo doll that give it to Uncle Scrooge, and he never deviated from his course. He'd been at it all those years.
Do you know what you started out with first in that story? Did you start out with a character of the zombie, or with a situation, or
Well,
camera?
I think it started out with Donald getting a voodoo curse. I think that's the first thing. And then I figured, well, how does he get the curse? He has to get a hold of a voodoo doll and he got to squeeze a voodoo doll and get one of those poison needles in him. So how would he get it? And that's how I began developing. And so I brought in old Bambi the Zombie to give him the doll. And old Bambi turned out to be such an interesting character. I worked a lot of stuff in there for him, like his winning the television or radio program for intelligence.
In the Trick or Treat story, you actually adapted, I guess, an animated cartoon or a story from an animated cartoon.
Well, were any photostats of the storyboard?
Were there particular problems in doing that?
No terrible big problem.
you added a lot to the.
Well, I did, and it got cut out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What about a story like The Golden Helmet? How did that one come about?
Well, that too came about from thinking of a situation in locale, host of Labrador. I believe I was looking at one of the Prince Valiant strips in which Prince Valiant had come to the coast of Labrador, and I was very much taken with one of the scenes where the Viking ship was coming into the coast there, and there's a very dramatic drawing, and I was so inspired to work with that Labrador coastline that I just tried to think of something that would happen to Donald to bring him up there, and there it was the fact that Leif Erikson or some of those Norsemen had landed there hundreds of years ago, and they might have left some symbol of their occupancy of that country right there, some little thing that would have given them title to it. And so I thought of the golden helmet and of a long descended relative of this Eric the Red or whoever he was, wanting to find this one symbol which could give him the ownership of North America. Of course, it's stretching law quite a bit, but it was a situation that just developed out of wanting to draw the coast of Labrador.
Yeah, most of the stories we've been talking about are far into periods, like Square Egg story and the creation of Gladstone and Scrooge, and then about a year or two later, the creation of the Beagle Boys and Gyro. It seems like there's sort of bursts of creativity where you're suddenly creating a lot of new characters and doing even better stories than you usually do. And do you have any sense of like a situation or how you were feeling or any such thing during these periods?
I think that once I had developed a set of characters, like when I developed Scrooge and Gladstone, there were quite a few stories that I could use them in very readily without having to struggle too hard. So I would use them quite extensively. Then when they began to be a little hard to write about, why, I scored that and invent some more. A whole new stock for the stable.
What about Old California? That's a story that you, on occasion, and you've been forced to ask what your sentimental favorite is. You've said, well, it's probably Old California. Why is that?
Well, I was able to present a little love story in that, and also got in a great deal of nostalgia and a little history and a little bit of villainy. And
that was the first pig bad guy, right? Don Porco de Lardo.
Yeah, I was able to get some crazy names.
This is really like old relics and ghost towns and earlier ages. And what is there that you like about this kind of thing?
Well, I don't know how come, but I wrote so many stories about the far away and the long ago. It just seemed as if that was a subject in which I couldn't get into much trouble with. That is, I could do nearly anything with my characters in those kind of situations, and it would be excusable.
I've always wondered if you had a particular love for the Old West or an earlier time where people weren't as constricted by the city and by civilization.
Oh, yes, I had a love for the Old West, the wide open spaces, all that stuff. I can remember when I myself was a young kid with plenty of room to roam around in, with a gun to shoot and horses to ride, all those things. It was part of the formation of my character, I guess. I remember those things, the niceness of having all kinds of room around you.
Did you have any problems with censorship?
Well, it's all pretty well known that I had censorship on that Klondike story and the Trick or Treat story, Milkman story of Donald's foot race with Daisy or some girl, and the story of the golden apples. Yeah, there was not much in the way of small censorship. But then I was so careful with my own censorship that didn't run into that problem much. It was just on the big things like the Klondike story that I got slapped with much censorship.
You say that you censored yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about what kinds of things you thought you should leave out? The things you might have wanted to put in?
Well, I knew that I couldn't put in much in the way of violence. It had to be comical violence. It didn't seem to hurt anybody. And
was this always true, or did it have anything to do with a comics code in your 50s?
I don't know about the comic code, whether that kind of differentiation was ever made on violence or not. But I knew that I was not to glorify crime, stealing, and so on, although I could have the Beagle Boys always stealing and so on. But I tried to do it in a very comical way, so that it actually was not a crime that a child could imitate. It had to be, in my opinion, a crime that was just in a world of fantasy. Kids could read about it, but they could not in any way ever imitate it.
Disney's often noted for not having any sexuality or anything, being very puritanical or pure. Did you, I know in some of the unpublished work that Goldie is much different than you'd expect from a comic book character. Did you ever want to put more of that kind of stuff in your stories?
I've thought at times that it could have gone a little bit more toward the teenage type of sexual interest, kissing and hand-holding and that sort of thing. But I never thought of the comic books, especially of the Ducks, as being sexy. I just seemed to me like their interest was in other things rather than in sex.
What about the problem of death? Sex and death go together, so...
Well, the characters had to be in danger of death in order to create suspense in a story. They had to be in real danger, and when you figure that the very ultimate in danger is death, the fear of death itself, you just about had to use it. So all of the times these ducks got in bad situations, they did have that opportunity of dying in case they got clobbered. So it made it more true to life to have them up against these impossible situations which they could lose their lives if they didn't win. Mm-hmm. And the vacation parade sequence where they buried themselves while the forest fire went over, you bet they were in danger. It made the story memorable.
There does seem to be a kind of strain of pessimism and cynicism also in your stories. They're very funny, but there's a kind of darkness at times. You want to...
I read some of my stories here recently, and I thought, how in the hell did I get away with that? I had just a real raw cynicism in some of them. There was one that was reprinted here not long ago. It was so cynical, I thought...
Which one, the Cornelius Coote story?
I believe it was, yeah. Oh man, that was full of cynicism.
Is that how you felt at the time about politicians or politics?
Or it was, there are bad politicians and there are good ones. I was just poking fun at the bad ones at that time. Sure.
What about the mystery stories like Ghost of the Grotto and Old Castle Secret, where there's an element of the sort of horror story?
Yeah, there was a little bit of the horror story element in those, certainly. An old skeleton whirled up in the walls of an old castle, yeah, that's almost in the EC Comics field. But those things are interesting, and I managed to put it over, I think, without having much morbidity about it.
Mm-hmm.
The crazy family tree that he had over there in the castle, all those old knights, these ancestors with their queer names.
Carl, do you have any idea of why people like your comics?
Well, they seemed to be interested because what I was writing about was a very real world. The characters were involved in things that they themselves get involved in. The people that write the letters that had situations just like old Donald has had. It's so close to real life. My villains always had a slight good streak in them. Even the Beagle Boys once in a while show some sign of humanity. And my good guys, they all had bad streaks. Donald could be a selfish, an arrogant little coot. Yeah, it was the fact that my characters were like human characters. They weren't just one-dimensional. They had a whole lot to them.
The fact that they were ducks rather than people, what did that have to do, do you think, with humanizing them? How were you able to do that?
Oh, I never thought of them as ducks. For me, they were humans from the start. Yeah, I never thought of them as being ducks that lived in a world of animal people, dog faces and so on. I just thought of them being humans. They just happened to be humans that look like ducks. I guess that's the only explanation I can think of for my attitude toward them.
There's one story that's not typical of any of your other stories, in which Donald and the kids confront human beings rather than other animals as they usually do. Did you have any particular problems in working that out? It never occurred again, I don't think.
If you're thinking of the story of Dangerous Disguise,
Yes.
well, that was a situation in which I somehow couldn't visualize all these master spies for all the different nations as being dog faces or pig faces. Somehow I visualized them as looking like they do in the movies, these suave-looking characters and the beautiful girl spies and so on. To me, some way they just had to look like human beings. I just couldn't see them any other way. So I went ahead and drew them like that, and I got called up on the carpet for it.
Why did they like it?
Oh, they said that Donald and the ducks just didn't look right working alongside of human beings. And when I looked back at the old Mickey strips and the others, I realized that always the other characters that were working with Mickey or the ducks were always dog faces or pig faces. They never were humans.
You mentioned once that you always wanted to do a strip with humans, an adventure strip or a romance strip. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, my first love would have been to have drawn stuff for human character. Almost like Prince Valiant, you might say. That, of course, I could never have drawn that well, but that would have been the kind of thing I would have gone into and probably gone broke. I couldn't have sold my stuff, as I just was a comedian, I guess, a writer of comedy, and whether I would have found a way of drawing human characters in a situation like I did with the Ducks, of being comedians solving serious problems. Now, I might have been able to have invented a set of characters that would fit like that, be human characters, but I didn't have the time to work it out, and so I just stayed in the old duck rut, and what happened.
Did you feel that, well, from what I gather from what you're saying, that you yourself would rank something like Prince Valiant as more artistic or something than the kind of thing you did?
Well, Prince Valiant was beautifully illustrated, and each panel was a work of art. I don't think I could have ever have come up with that, because I didn't have the artistic background, the learning, you might say, to draw that well. I would have had to have worked on something much simpler. I probably would have gotten into the field of Western stories, like the old Gene Autry's and so on, where the backgrounds could have been about simple things that I understood and knew about.
In other words, you think Hal Foster could have done what you did?
Oh, I don't think that he would have worked very well with the Ducks. That would have been a field that he wouldn't have fitted into at all. He was more of an artist and a serious thinker.
Well, why do you like adventure and romance strips more than in what you did? Why do they appeal to you more?
Well, because they're different. After working on ducks for all those years, I'm just a little tired of that type of reading. I like to read something that is different.
But you said you wanted to do it more than those.
That I wanted to do that type thing more? Well, after working at this Disney studio and all those funny animals and seeing Bugs Bunny and so on, I would have liked to have gotten out of the funny animals field. And I like to draw humans. I like to draw faces.
You'd rather
figures. Yeah,
you'd rather do that than
from
the beginning.
Yeah, I would have liked to have done that in the beginning.
Do you think you could have made some kind of more serious statement in that medium than in the?
Undoubtedly, I could have made more serious statements and gotten into philosophy and psychology, all those kind of things before.
Is that what you really wanted to do?
No, but I would have gotten into it accidentally.
But well, you did anyway, of course.
But the human characters, I would have loved to have worked on them, because I felt that I could take going to town like Duckburg, people with humans. I could have drawn 1,000 different faces. So many of our artists that draw the characters, their girls all look alike. Their heroes all have the same profile, the same chin, everything. And it's almost as if they stamp their stuff out with a rubber stamp. And they have a certain set of frozen smiles and leers and sidelong glances. All of that stuff you look at their strip one week and then look at it again the next week, and it's just like it was all done with no imagination or no new interest at all. I would have drawn 1,000 faces, as I say. I would have had every expression related directly to what was being said. I have read that in my fan letter, that my ducks always seemed to be thinking exactly what they were saying. Their expressions were always fitted right to that balloon of dialogue.
Well, that's a really interesting issue that we were talking about earlier. The relationship of the text to the image, and how, in a way, the image entices a child to want to read the words and see what's going on. Was that something you were consciously trying to do?
Well, I tried to make the drawing fit the dialogue. The fact that I did my dialogue first always helped that along.
Oh, you started with a script first, a written script or
I
dialogue?
start with a written script, and of course the dialogue is the key. That is the thing that hung it all together.
Which do you think is more important, the image or the text, or do you think that one is more important than the other?
Oh, when you first open a comic book, the image is the thing. If you're attracted to the image, then you're interested enough to read the script. Therefore, the script would be secondary.
What about gagging? Do you think the same relationship holds there?
In gagging, the visual gag is more important than the dialogue gag. In dialogue gag, you've got to depend on people's ability to read and to understand what little idioms you're using, and it got to also figure on it being translated into foreign countries. So if you're leaning heavily on dialogue gags, why, it's a pretty flimsy prop.
Some of the most spectacular things in your comics were the splash panels. And it's very rare in Funny Animal comics to see anything like that. What, can you tell us how you worked those up, and how long some of them took you to draw, like the huge steam shovel battle and the money dam exploding and so on?
Well, the big splash panel naturally was at the height of some situation, the climax of some situation, maybe not of the whole story, but of the build-up of sequences, like where the two steam shovels are, one's coming down the street this way and the other's coming the other way, and what happens when they meet. And I thought it was worthwhile to put it in a big panel where I could show all that machinery slashing at each other. You try to crowd that into too small a panel and you lose too much detail. In those splash panels, there was a lot of detail. A lot of coins, or a lot of machinery, or a lot of people, or something that required lots of room in order to put it over. So the splash panel was planned for well in advance. And I just saved up all of these different things so that I had room to draw them finally in one big dramatic situation.
Did you like drawing splash panels more than the smaller panels because you could do more with it?
Well, I guess I did like to draw them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have put them in, because it would take me 2 or 3 days to draw one of them. That one of the square egg city, when they first come out of the bottom of the fog, and there they see this thing down there. Oh, I was laboring for about 3 days on the drawings of that. And then I got my perspective too forced, so that the buildings came out diamond-shaped down in the lower part.
Were there any particular problems drawing splash panels that you might remember?
Or I'll say the problem was that they were so easy to cut out down at the office. Yeah, that was one of the things. I could put in a splash panel and tell a whole lot in that one panel. And then when it got down to the office, why, if they needed to run an ad, they could look back at that. They could look at that page and say, well, we could cut out this whole half a page here and run something about air rifles or chewing gum.
Do you feel it changed the nature of the stories and the way you developed them when you decided, as we know you did later, simply not to use splash panels? Did that restrict certain things that you could do in comics?
Nobody told me I couldn't use.
I know you just but when they cut them out, you decided that.
Oh yeah, I got to the point where I thought, well, why bother to draw these big splash panels? Yeah, toward the last there, they were doing so much of this business of cutting out and inserting ads. It seems as if they had a bunch of advertising salesmen back in Poughkeepsie who were always out selling these pages to the different advertisers. And I would do a story and send it in down here at the office, and maybe Chase Craig and these guys would have the book all planned to go through with a 10-page story, and then here would come word out of Poughkeepsie, cut a page. We're going to have to run a chewing gum ad. So they'd have to go and cut a page out of one of my stories. And it got to be so prevalent, so much of it going on, that toward the last, I had a quaky feeling every time I wrote a story, and just wondering where they're going to be able to make a cut. It inhibited my thinking quite a bit.
One time you said, maybe half joking, that you almost put in some extra pages, figuring that if they were going to cut something, they'd be these pages rather than something that you really weren't.
I believe there was a time or two when I deliberately put in a page of just plain old padding. It could be lifted out and the two sections joined together and make a better story. Yeah, I did that a time or two.
When you're talking to Bob Clampett and Ward Kimball about uniformity in the animation, they used model sheets so that everyone could draw the characters the same way. And around 1950, you did model sheets for the comic books. And yet, that all of a sudden, you were no longer doing, for example, the Donald Duck comic books. Do you have any idea why it was more possible for the animation to retain some kind of uniformity when, in fact, the comic books didn't?
The animation, I guess, appears to be, like you say, there's more uniformity in how all the guys draw the ducks. It's because the director tells them exactly what they're to draw. And there's certain poses that they cannot or will not put over in animation. They always have to look good, in other words. We were supposed to do that in the comic books too, but I never did. I never followed the rule closely. If I had to show the bottom of Donald's beak, I did it. And as Don was saying earlier, that I managed to make him look fairly good any pose that I found for the duck. That was just by using an eraser a great deal. I would just keep working on him until he did look respectable in any of those positions. But one pose that apparently they don't like to do in animation or in the newspaper comic strips is the underside of Donald's beak, where he's got his head tilted back and you show the underside of his beak. It looks like a continuation of his neck, and it hides all the rest of his face, and so it is called an ugly pose, and one that is to be scrupulously avoided. But I used it a time or two. One was on the cover on the magazine.
Couple of
them. Yeah, that's right. In the
Scrooge one.
Scrooge one, yeah, that was the underside of Don's beak. But I did show enough of Donald's face that you can see some expression.
Sure could.
There. Yeah.
Sure could.
Just straight on the underside of the beak would be very uninteresting.
One of the things that all of us who have followed your stuff notice, and it always surprises you, is that we can tell when your stories were done by the way Donald is drawn. Could you talk a little bit about why you changed Donald, especially the famous change in 49, when 48 and 49, when he suddenly gets a longer beak for a couple of years and then it shrinks rather rapidly. In fact, again, it sort of shrinks during one story in late 49.
Well, I was very conscious of criticism from over my readers or friends. Or I guess about that time there was somebody that had come out from the Disney studio, and one of the women that lived up the road was an inker at Disney's. And I think she was the first one that told me that the word is out all around the studio that you draw that beak too long. And so I started shortening the duck's beak. And then I got criticism from a letter, or no, it wouldn't have been a letter at that time. It would have been from some other person, either in the story department at Disney's or in the editorial office, that I was making the beak too short. I was making the duck look too much like Al Taliaferro's duck. And so I would make these changes to try to please someone else. Not that I had noticed anything wrong. And that other change in which I started making the duck quite tall, and the nephew's quite tall, the head small in relation to the body, and standing them up straighter, that too came from trying to get a duck that looked a little bit more like the comic strip duck, the newspaper comic strip duck. Because somehow Al Taliaferro always stood that duck up much straighter than I did. And he had a head that was smaller in proportion to his overall height. And another thing that influenced me at that time was the paper, the drawing paper. The company got a whole bunch of it in from Germany that was coated with a kind of soft chalk. And whenever I would make my rough drawing, the pencil would make little trenches. And I've always drawn that duck too tall. Always have. And with good paper, I would just erase it and redraw him again. And since there was a trench that was already made there on my pencil from making that tall duck, I would always getting my pen line stuck in that trench and drawing him that way anyway. So I thought, oh, heck with this. I'll just draw that duck the way he comes out in the first rough. Nobody likes it. Why, they better get me some better paper. So they did. They got, in a couple of years' time, they got some better paper. Still from West Germany, but it was a better grade of paper.
Yeah, what about this question of if you think it would be possible to make three-dimensional models of your characters that would actually look like they look from panel to panel in your comics? Well, you indicated that you had to fool around with it, right? To make them look the best from any point of view.
Well, I just had to draw my characters in any situation in which the story required them to look a certain way. I had to work on them until they did look that way. They could have been molded into a clay model and still look right in the poses I put them into. I don't know, and whether such a clay model could be manipulated so that you could turn the head and it would still look right or not. That is something I never got into, and I never had any desire to make clay models of my characters.
Did you ever try to introduce a moral into the stories? Often it seemed to me there was a moral. It was somewhat subtle. You didn't try to hit anybody over the head with it, but there seemed to be a point to a lot of your stories.
Sometimes the moral was undercut, too.
That come in once in a while, deliberately. And often it would be something that developed as I was writing on the story. I would notice that maybe I should just play up this angle a little bit. Yeah, I would put them in once in a while, consciously, and at other times they just slid in without any effort.
Was there anything you were trying to say to your audience in particular? Any points you were trying to get across?
Well, just to stop things like crime does not pay and pride goeth before a fall. Just the...
What about a story that just occurred to me, like the $10 bill story, where there's a specific moral stated at the end, where Donald tries to return the $10 bill, and all of these horribly despicable characters come along, and finally he does get it back by accident almost, to the rightful owner, and Donald and his nephews walk off at the end with halos over their heads. And the moral at the end really seems to contradict the fact that if you try to be honest, which is what Donald's trying to do, you're just going to get destroyed. And yet at the end they say, well, know that it's always better to be honest, and so on. And that seemed to be one of those radical cases of where the stated moral is somehow in opposition to what the story is actually proves.
Oh, I stuck that last line on there because I had felt that it needed something like that added to it, just to give it strength or to explain that strange ending that I put on there. In real life, Donald would have kept the $10 bill and spent it on himself.
I'm kind of curious as to what some of your political views are, if you have any.
I think that what I was trying to put over, if I did go into political things at any time, was that it's better to just have a free government like we have, where everybody can do as they darn well please, rather than to be locked up in Brutopia where you have to obey a whole bunch of rulers. But I avoided politics mostly because it's a very uninteresting subject to young kids, and it's a subject that can get you into a lot of hot water. And my own political philosophy is that we got a pretty good thing where the way we got it now, and we should just leave it damn well alone. We can have water gates and all kinds of things, but nobody gets hurt, nobody gets destroyed, nobody goes to prison. We just have a lot of fun as we go along. Everybody's robbing everybody else, but it's something you expect. Wouldn't it be great if, 1,000 years from now, my stories were like Aesop's fables? They just keep right on going, never die. That'd be an ideal situation. I want to check up on that.